Yes, I have questioned the existence of God, and I feel that such questioning is necessary for affirming a belief in God. My name is Marvin Sanguinetti. I am an academic theologian who pursue research in theology and religious studies, biblical studies, and Christian theology.
Have you ever questioned the existence of God?
Yes, I have questioned the existence of God, and I feel that such questioning is necessary for affirming a belief in God. It was the French skeptic Rene Descartes who says, "I think, therefore I am." So the questioning of the existence of God is the act of critical thinking. That essentially helps to affirm my belief even further in God.
Do you believe there is a God and why?
The existence of God is the result of various arguments put forward by different theologians. And as a theologian, I affirm those arguments, such as arguments from the world. You look at the world and you see there's order in the world and so on. You also look at design in the world, and when you look at how the world is designed, those are some of the means, the arguments that would, I would say, help me to believe in the existence of God, as well as the experiential dimension. By that I mean one's experience of the divine, of something beyond oneself, also helps me to be convinced that there is a God, rather than not a God, if I may. It seems to me that if you are able to conceive that there is a God, we are then forced to ask the question, what is the origin of such conception? So it's from that perspective I would say, yes, I definitely believe in God.
How do you believe there is a God when there's so much going on in the world? Wars, children dying, people getting killed for no reason. So with all that disorder and all those bad things happening, how do you still believe there's a God?
What you have highlighted in your question is what we call in theology the problem of suffering and evil. And in response to the problems of suffering and evil, we have devised a means of responding to those issues, and we call that a theodicy. A theodicy. A theodicy is really ways in which we can respond to the problems of suffering and evil, and the ways in which we do that. Number one, we say that human beings, we have our own responsibilities as well. There are some evil in the world that are caused not by God, but are caused because we have chosen to do evil things. So that's one way in which we respond to the problem of suffering and evil. Secondly, as human beings, even if there isn't a God, death is the culmination of life. And so God cannot be blamed for death, seeing that it is the natural process for the order of life. So I think those are the type of arguments I put forward for for how we respond to the problem of suffering and evil without necessarily blaming God. The thing about that is oftentimes when bad things happen in the world, terrorists flying planes in Twin Towers, the tsunami and such like, we tend to blame God. Why didn't God do something about it? But when the good things happen to human beings in the world, we tend to credit humanity rather than God. So there seems to be an imbalance even in the question asked often.
Why do you believe God doesn't stop bad things from happening?
That would be a violation of the very creatorial ability in which he has given human beings, and that is choice. If God overrides our choice, then that would mean that he would essentially be going against what he has created us to do. And from the very beginning of time, in the Christian worldview, in the Garden of Eden as we know it, he has given us a choice, good or evil. eat of this tree or not eat of that tree. And so I celebrate the idea of a God that gives choice rather than a God who's a dictator and an autocrat, doesn't allow choice at all. And I think choice is responsible for some of the evils that we see in our world today. We can choose to be good and we can choose to do evil.
If you believe in God, does that mean you are against science?
In actual fact, it has been a travesty and tragedy of the history of the church because many scientists were religious. Many of the known scientists had the church at the very backdrop, even in the forefront of their minds with their scientific pursuits. And so I think the church has done itself a disservice by relegating science to the back burner. You know, we have in Britain and America the Industrial Revolution, where work and business took over and God took a back seat and so on and so forth. And some Christians have actually allowed that. And one way in which they allowed that as well, it's by taking an anti-intellectual pursuit over against a spiritual pursuit. We saw these two things as dichotomies rather than as complementary to each other. So science should not be necessarily contradictory to theology, even though they're two different disciplines, but should be in support of theology vis-a-vis or vice versa. Yeah.
Why do you believe most people doubt the existence of God?
There are practical reasons for doubting God's existence. René Descartes talks about, the French philosopher I mentioned earlier, talked about systematic doubt. And sometimes systematic doubt is not handled very well by human beings. We look at critical engagement, asking probing questions, and when we do that, it leads us to a negative result in terms of our experiences with God. And so on the experiential level, many people also doubt God because of the experiences they have in life. So you have lost a loved one. You thought God would have cured your one daughter from cancer. She died. You prayed, but the thing you prayed for has gotten worse and stuff of that nature. So on the experiential dimension, you find that people lose faith in God based on God, in their perception, not doing things as and when they required them to be done. So the experiential side of things could be the reasons why many people doubt the existence of God. Then you have the intellectual, what we would call atheists. The intellectual atheist or new atheism, you know, late Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins and stuff, and people like that who actually approach atheism from an intellectual perspective and see that some of the arguments we put forward for the existence of God as theologians, they don't think that they could acquiesce or they could affirm those arguments, or they see loopholes in them. But in my estimation, when you put all these arguments together in a kind of what we call combinatorial or combined way, you find that they create a kind of formidable conviction. It's hard to say there is not a God. I'm more likely to argue that it's harder to prove the non-existence of a thing than to prove its existence as we relate to God. And science doesn't prove non-existence. So theology takes over from there. We prove the fact that God exists from a theological perspective.
Have you ever had an experience which made you doubt God?
In actual fact, as I've mentioned earlier, systematic doubt is the route to enhance one's faith. And in my experience of studying theology, I have asked many of the very probing questions. I think it was, if I'm remembering rightly, a Jewish scholar, Pascal, Blaise Pascal, Pascal's wager they call it. So if there is not a God, right, we wouldn't have lost anything if there isn't a God. But what if there is a God and I concluded earlier that there isn't one? I would have lost everything. So the idea of doubt, I think, is beneficial for all theologians and Christians, and I suspect that all of us at some points, question, if not doubt, whether God exists or not. And not only that, is there life beyond the grave? And the big questions of life, we ask those questions. And so I think that's healthy. So, yes, I have doubted the existence of God. If even in my theological pursuits. But in the back of my mind, there is always something that says, well, there seems to be something outside of myself that draws me toward the idea of the existence of something else beyond me and beyond human beings and so on. And I think I'm not quite satisfied with the scientific explanations as to why we are here and where we go when we die and stuff of that nature, and why, as you've asked earlier, good people suffer and bad people live long. So I'm not quite sure science has actually answered those questions in my mind's eye to a sufficient degree where I'm totally satisfied, so I could become an atheist or an agnostic even.
What would you say to someone who says that there is no God and you believing in God is like you believing in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus?
In actual fact, as theologians, we are very familiar with what we call myth making. And oftentimes when we think about myths, we normally think about something that is untrue. But even fairy tales have a representative or represents something else in concrete reality. So if you have Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, if you have the Loch Ness Monster, if you have a unicorn, the question is, could this in the mind of those who perceive it be representing something on a deep level? And I seem to take that conclusion because how else would that be conceived within the human mind and the human psyche and the human experience if something like it does not exist? So I think the idea of what we call metaphysics, the idea of existence, is one that still needs further exploration, but it's one that I feel quite confident in. That affirms God's existence in my mind's eye. If you agree with scientific methodology, one of its laws says for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. My question is, the action we have is belief or non-belief. What is the opposite of that? And that's the challenge. So for every action, there's an opposite equal reaction. We have the reaction of belief and or non-belief. What is the opposite of that? And that drives me to seek on a deeper level, maybe something is there beyond myself. I would like to also just encourage those that are agnostics who think that if there is a God, the word Gnosticism, gnosis, the possibility of knowledge, another theological word is epistemology, what can be known. I would suggest that as agnostics, to continue to pursue further information outside of what is found in the literature alone. Is there an experiential dimension? As late Oxford Professor Ninian Smart says, that there is a supernatural dimension. Is there something beyond ourselves for the agnostics? And for the atheists, interestingly, the word atheist in Greek, and theos, atheos, you're saying there is no God, but you still have to use God as your standard to deny his existence. So it appears to me that there's a methodology of denial that is happening there. And if we're true to scientific methods, it seems to be leading to the existence of a God, in my view. One of the points that led me, I would say, to doubt God at a particular time was the passing of my own mother. Because my mother lived, in my estimation, a very good life. And I thought that she would have had a longer life. So, of course, introspectively, I ask, God, you know I've served you. You know I have committed my life to you. I've committed my life to the Christian community, to theological pursuit, to developing others, and so on and so forth. Why did you allow my mom to die? And stuff of that nature. So there's a sense of doubt. But what eventually helped me through that is the Christian community that I had around me as well as that inward peace that follows that doubt, that inward peace that says, she has done what she needed to do, she is now at rest, and so on. So I don't think it was a lasting doubt, but there were periods in which you wondered, could she have lived longer? Could God have given her a little bit more time and stuff of that nature. With the passing of my dad also, that was more acceptable because he has reached a ripe old age in comparison to my mom, and so on. So that you would still have periods in which you doubt God, lost a loved one, stuff of that nature, the timings when we expect God to do certain things, he doesn't appears to do it. But in my experience, and I'm talking about 36 years as a Christian, God always, and I append this to God, I give it to God, always seem to make a way or a way out for me. And that, so yes, that's one of the testimonials I have for doubting God, but also coming back to trust in God. I think there was a text in the Bible that says, the man says, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. So I think belief and unbelief sometimes thrives together for the betterment of those of us who believe in God and others. Thank you.